car beside us had a car bomb in it. And, you know, I recall my father's fear.
Two of my very close friends did 13 years for conspiracy and possession of firearms.
My father's business was blown up twice in the early 70s, and my uncle's house was burned down.
I grew up in a polarised society with policemen with guns and army with guns and you know, bombs and death.
This is tragedy. This is, you know, people losing their lives, people being maimed. You can't believe that the horrors are on your doorstep.
I got a call to say, look, this is happening. The people that have murdered your dad are getting out.
In 1968, Northern Ireland erupted into violence. Violence that would continue for many years and claim many lives. For those of us who grew up during that period, the memories will stay with us forever. The bombings, the shootings, the rioting, the fear. Everybody has their own often raw experience of a complex conflict with a very simple name: the Troubles.
It's 40 years now since the Troubles began, and many people want to move on. They want to forget, they don't want to talk about them. This program's not about who was right and who was wrong. This program's about stories, and they're stories from people you know. It doesn't make their stories any better or any worse than anyone else's stories. It just makes it their stories of the Troubles.
Living and growing up in a working class area of Belfast, the Troubles were all around me.
This is the street in which I grew up, and it's amazing how you could go about your day-to-day business and insulate yourself from what was going on in Northern Ireland. I particularly remember a day called Bloody Friday. We were playing football in this street, and all around, because we're elevated, we're above the city here, plumes of smoke going up Oxford Street bus station, Cave Hill Road shops over there. So many people killed that day in this spate of bombings all around Belfast. And each time as kids we stopped, we lifted the ball, we went, wow, what's that? And then you went on and you played, you continued the game, just oblivious to what was going on. Until the message comes home, usually, somebody knows somebody who was killed or injured at some stage.
I was 8 years old when the Troubles began. It was all sparked off by a civil rights march through Derry. The demonstrators were nearly all Catholic who felt discriminated against when it came to getting jobs and houses. It was a peaceful march, but this was the response of the Protestant-dominated police. Scenes like these made Catholics even more determined to demand equal rights. Many Protestants were equally determined to resist. Within a year, the two communities were polarized. And as mistrust turned to hatred, mixed neighborhoods like mine began to disappear.
Suppose my first realization that this whole conflict was more than just name-calling or stone-throwing came when I was just about 11 years of age, playing the usual Friday night game of football up in the playing fields here, making our way home. And a sound in the air that I'd never heard before, don't want to hear again, loud cracking noise. And this cracking noise was roof tiles burning. This whole horizon, this is our down here in the distance, and there was a street called Farringdon Gardens. And people were so afraid of their neighbours, Protestant people were moving out of their houses, and they wouldn't leave them behind in case Catholic families moved into them, so they burnt them. They were burning their own homes. Such was the fear and such was the panic. And that panic was spreading all around the whole neighbourhood, because here people were starting to put up barricades, put cars across the road. This Joy King Chinese restaurant, this was a petrol station at the time, and people were running to the forecourts, and I remember standing here watching people filling up milk bottles full of petrol and putting rags into the top of them, crates and crates of petrol bombs to defend themselves from, I'm sure they didn't know what, but they were going to be ready. And naturally, we made our way home as quickly as we could, just a couple of 100 yards. And like many families that night, we fled Belfast, and we fled for a couple of weeks. We became evacuees like thousands and thousands of others.
I was a Catholic kid. We had our traditions, and the majority Protestant population had theirs.
My father was a primary school headmaster. I mean, came from a big family, working class family in Ballymena, working class Protestant family. And when I think of my childhood and the Troubles, it actually reminds me of, you know, the happiness of marching on the 12th.
Every year on July 12th, Protestants celebrate the defeat of the Catholic King James in a battle in 1690. It's the high point of their marching season, and these days it's largely peaceful. But often during the Troubles, it triggered resentment and violence.
As politicians on all sides garnered more power, I think clearly it became a bit of a political football, the whole marching thing. I do remember all the body searching and all that, and getting up to Belfast and being fascinated by the tanks. But if anything, what it's taught me, you know, time has taught me to see it from a different perspective, and how terrifying it must have been.
The marching season of 1969 was truly terrifying. It ended in widespread rioting and brought the first deaths of the Troubles. Paramilitary groups were emerging on both sides, and the British Army sent in troops in an attempt to keep the peace.
We as a family were sitting in a place called Hillsborough in County Down, about 14, 15 miles from Belfast. And as we were watching the news, there was that unreal element about it. It might as well have been Baghdad or somewhere, except that the reality was there, and yet, if you weren't in the middle of it, or if it hadn't landed on your doorstep, it was hard to take on board the enormity of what was to happen and what it was to become.
If you are on the streets in a little minute's time, you'll be liable to arrest.
Most Catholics had at first welcomed the army, but the soldiers soon developed a reputation for heavy-handed tactics, and what support they had in Catholic neighbourhoods was soon lost.
Hit the British Army! Hit the British Army! Clap your hands!
I remember the excitement about the army doing their patrols, because I was Protestant, and subconsciously I knew I felt they were on my side.
So it was easy to see why many Catholics regarded the soldiers as enemies. I lived in a street of mixed religion, but even if you didn't go looking for trouble, trouble could come looking for you.
We were about, what, 10, 11?
10, 11. 4 or 5 soldiers came over each Otege, like the Grand National, and they came straight through.
They were with those big rifles. What were they called?
SLRs.
SLRs, and there's us standing there with our mouths hanging open thinking, what's this? It was like something from a movie or something, wasn't it?
Down.
It was a dark Friday night.
Pushed
and then
us
we're all pushed down onto the ground. It was like a scene from Iraq.
That's right.
And they took us off in various directions, and they checked out our identity. And what had we done? What had we done? What we doing?
Played in your back garden.
Kicking football or something.
Football.
And then when they checked us all out, and it was all okay, and they realised we were up to nothing, they just took off. They trooped down there.
the side of the house.
March, and a big armoured car arrived, the Saracen. Yeah, it came and took them all away. And then we run inside to see Mum and Dad to say,
unaware.
You never guess what happened to us. We were arrested. The army had us, they detained us, and they didn't believe a word we said.
Wise up. That's it.
Yeah, wise up.
But amid all that mayhem, families tried to carry on as they'd always done. But the most basic things, like getting an education even, were a challenge.
I don't think we ever had a full week, certainly not a full fortnight, without schooling being disrupted. Whether it was your bus being hijacked, whether it was a barricade being built out there, whether it was a riot, some sort of demonstration, power cuts, strikes, all sorts of things going on. All around this school, some of the places that saw the worst of the troubles and suffered most. New Lodge, Lower Shankill, Crumlin Road, Ardoyne, Old Park. Collectively, that was known as the Murder Triangle. It was difficult to get to school. Almost every week there was some sort of problem. But once you were inside here, there was no talk of politics. It was a place of learning. It was a place of peace. It was an oasis in a sea of turmoil like there.
My school, St Malachy's College, was a Catholic grammar. My Protestant friends had their own schools. Our education may have been different, but as the troubles went on, our problems would be the same.
You know, a friend of mine who went to school, his father was murdered. We had our science teacher who was caught in crossfire.
I know enough Protestants who have lost people, you know. I know a lot of people in the police who lost colleagues. I know people who lost spouses. I know people who lost children.
By 1972, British troops had been in Northern Ireland for 3 years and had long since lost the support of the Catholic community. They were seen as propping up Stormont, the Protestant-dominated parliament that had ruled since 1922, when the country was partitioned from the rest of Ireland. They were also held responsible for civilian deaths, and in many predominantly Catholic neighbourhoods, the soldiers were anything but welcome.
And this is actually where I was born and lived for the first 8 years of my life. I think what the army never banked on here was the closeness of community, and this happens all over in these ghetto areas all over Northern Ireland, that when they were oppressed, instead of getting the better of them, they all stuck together and they all had something in common. I mean, they had nothing to lose really, because so many of them hadn't got anything.
Protestant neighbourhoods were just as tribal, and many of them too felt they had nothing to lose. Sadly, the paramilitary groups found it easy to recruit members on both sides of the fence. The violence reached its height in 1972, with 500 deaths and 5,000 casualties. By then, the Provisional IRA had declared war on Britain. It wanted a united Ireland, and it was prepared to cause havoc to get it. One bomb attack in March 1972 was on the Abercorn restaurant in central Belfast. It was full of women and children. 2 were killed, over 130 maimed. My own parents were nearly caught up in the blast. A young reporter, Gloria Honeyford, covered the clear-up. She recalls the scene just after the dead and injured were taken to hospital.
That was the first time I had experienced the aftermath of a bomb at close quarter. And I was absolutely horrified because tights, women's tights, you would have seen tights with one leg of the tights blown off. You've seen leather handbags that had been absolutely blown flat. Every seam had just been blown out of it. You've seen a teddy bear that was all charred down the side of one face. But that day it was really brought home to me, the futility of it all. All these, you know, men, women, children, young people in the prime of their lives who had all been caught in that bomb just because they happened to be out shopping on a Saturday afternoon.
IRA bombs didn't just kill and maim. They terrorized and paralyzed the country.
Come on, let them go. Come on, let them go.
When I was about maybe 8 or 9, so this would have been 73, 74, my father went to pay the car tax and at the county hall. And my sister and I were in the car. He left us in the car park, went into the town hall. We both fell asleep, I think, in the car, and woke up to this bell alarm bell ringing, and we saw people kind of running out in the distance from the evacuating the hall. And, you know, we were very young, didn't really know what was going on. This guy, this old warden came running over, said, get out, there's a bomb, come with me. So we got out of the car and we were running up to the clearing, and then as we were running up, we saw my father clearly running down and trying to break through to get to us. And then there was this very dull thud. And a huge smoke, and we went down, and, you know, the car beside us had a car bomb in it. And, you know, I recall my father's fear. But the other thing we remember is after school we'd gone to my grandmother's to pick up a dozen eggs, and the car was destroyed, but in the boot, the eggs, like 10 of them, were just perfectly intact.
Nobody was immune from the violence, not even the wealthy, largely Protestant business class who made up Northern Ireland's elite.
When I was very little, we lived closer to Belfast, and my father's business was blown up twice in the early 70s, and my uncle's house was burned down. And at that point, we moved to a place called Cultrall. I guess it was a bit of a bubble. But on the other hand, I also think my parents worked probably pretty hard to make sure that we weren't as worried as certainly they were. Sometimes I think of back to those days in Northern Ireland, and it's a little bit like that scene in Carry On Up the Khyber, where everyone's sort of sitting around a dinner table as the cannonballs are showering in, and sort of nobody's paying any attention to what's happening outside and sort of passing the port. I suppose our parents didn't want us to be terrified out of our wits.
There is a predicament when you're in a place like Northern Ireland during the Troubles and you have teenage children, is when I'm thinking of, because you have no thought of moving away, and yet you have to try and lead as normal a life as possible for the sake of your family life and your children and their well-being. But you had to make them particularly aware that they weren't allowed to go up certain roads at night. By necessity, we had to know where our children were going. You couldn't just let them go to a disco in Belfast and hope that that disco didn't get blown up. I had to know where they were.
During the height of the mid-70s Troubles, actor Charlie Lawson had been sent to Northern Ireland's most prestigious boarding school.
Charlie, I suppose most people know you as Jim MacDonald in Coronation Street, and I suppose because of the strength of that character and the popularity of that character, they wouldn't associate you, the person, with an education in a building as fine as this, Campbell College in Belfast.
No, you're right, Eamon. I mean, that is, you know, 10 years of my life I've played that character, and he certainly wasn't from this background. But, you know, as I say, I was firmly middle class. I mean, yourself, you wouldn't have been at a school like this, you know?
No,
but there were no Catholics here.
So you and I wouldn't have met in the mid-70s?
There's not a chance. The schools we played at rugby were Protestant schools. You played Gaelic football. There you go, you see. And you know, it was as simple as that. And I wouldn't have met you at all, Eamon, you know?
Yeah.
And I have to say, I probably wouldn't have wanted to. No, but, you know, that's what it was like.
It's true.
It is true.
The young Charlie may have enjoyed a privileged education, but as the IRA's terror campaign intensified, he became sympathetic to those on the opposite side of the sectarian divide, the loyalist paramilitaries.
The older I got, funnily enough, the further I wanted to be from this institution and the closer I wanted to be to out there, because you started to meet people, working class people, and maybe that's the thing that just all young men do, but it certainly affected me, and I found myself, in a sense, trying to go in the more, as you say, in the more working class direction of politics, in inverted commas, as opposed to the natural progression that would have been for me towards the Unionist Party in inverted commas.
But that meant getting your hands dirty. That would have meant being out there chucking stones, chucking petrol bombs, talking about paramilitary involvement. Which
I obviously didn't do. However, over the years, latterly, I did meet some interesting characters, shall we say. And although I never dipped my toe in those waters, Eamon, it was something that you know, you were very sort of proud to be, if you like, a loyalist. That was something that I aspired to. Had I spent longer here, then I might easily have got involved. Two of my very close friends did 13 years for conspiracy and possession of firearms.
In response to IRA violence throughout the mid-70s, Loyalist paramilitaries gained ground. The Ulster Defence Association, or UDA, and the Ulster Volunteer Force, the UVF, recruited heavily in working-class, staunchly Protestant areas like Belfast's Shankill Road. It was places like this where the teenage Charlie came to hang out.
What was here was the end of unionism and loyalism that my mindset was lent towards. Even though they were killing and blowing people up, it's extraordinary really, isn't it? Conflict does make things completely different. It's not a real life experience, and I don't mean that in a flippant way. What I mean is that life is never cheap, but in a sense, people accepted it because the night before someone was killing one of us, and therefore it became part of, it's frightening. As a young human being, it became part of your life. Apart from the fact you were used to being searched in every shop and all the rest of it, you know, killing was just so commonplace, and explosions and shootings all over the province, not just here or over the peace line in the Falls or whatever.
The Loyalist Shankill Road is surrounded by the Catholic Republican areas of Ardoyne and the Falls Road. Even today, the Shankill and the Falls are separated by a giant wall known as the Peace Line, and the two communities rarely, if ever, venture into each other's territory.
I have never been down the Falls Road, and perhaps this is a time when I should go down the Falls Road. On the left is the Peace Line, and has actually been extended and made bigger over the last few years, and it's not going to go. But when it wasn't here, it was a bloodbath, so that's why it's here. Through the gates. It's not the most beautiful part of the world, that's for sure. And despite all, I'm not sure I'd want to be wandering around here. You know, honestly, it seems to be an almost spiritual thing, something that's in you, that you look at things and you look at those murals back there and you look at sort of 1916 slogans, etc., etc., etc. There is something inside me that says, I don't belong here. We're now literally in 2008, through the gates, back on, in inverted commas, home territory. See? The Northern Ireland Supporters Club, red, white and blue. It's just making me smile. It makes me feel right. I feel secure here. I wonder if that's sad, and I wonder if it's interesting that that wasn't a life-changing experience for me, but it wasn't a life-changing experience for me, and I'm happier to be here on this side of the peace line, and I'm really sorry if that's depressing. I'm just being honest. So should we go and have a beer in the Rangers Supporters Club?
Although divisions still run deep, most people are working hard to put the old mistrust to one side. But what about those who lost loved ones? Can they ever put the troubles behind them?
How did you hear the news that your dad had been murdered?
20 years ago now. And I was 16 at the time. And it was that sort of, this is happening, but it isn't happening. It's a very sort of slow motion car crash.
As the 70s give way to the 80s, there still seemed to be no prospect of an end to Northern Ireland's troubles.
There were periods of time when I just thought, in my lifetime, there will never be a peace agreement, because I'd seen it shot down too many times.
No side in the conflict was prepared to give ground. In the top security Maze prison, Republican inmates campaigned to be treated as political prisoners rather than common criminals. Their protests culminated when they went on hunger strike. In April 1981, the leading hunger striker Bobby Sands was voted in as an MP in a by-election, but died shortly afterwards. His death unleashed a wave of sympathy for the Republicans, and the British government was accused of being inflexible.
Oh no, it is the hunger strikers and those who are coercing them. It is they who have been inflexible and intransigent. It is they who have said, you will starve unto death.
Despite all the news coverage, some of us who'd moved to England found that people there had little real knowledge of what was going on across the Irish Sea.
When I first came to drama school, I was a paddy the minute I walked in. I remember going into drama school and they all saying to me, oh yeah, Brits out, and I was like, it's a wee bit more complicated than that, you know. But it was actually quite an interesting, easy eye-opener into actually how they can just think of all of us as paddies put together, you know, right or wrong, whether or not that was a good thing or bad.
I mean, I was at drama school, and it was quite a good time to be there as an actor, because there weren't many Northern Irish actors around, and there was a lot of Northern Irish stuff, most of it complete rubbish, being brought out. You know what I mean? There was nothing worse. You always used to get these trendy knobheads from Watford writing plays about poor little Republicans and bad Protestants. It was just rubbish plays everywhere. But there was some good stuff. You know what I mean? And anyway, the Sheridan boys, Peter Sheridan, came up with this play, Diary of a Hunger Strike. It was this sort of Bobby Sands character and his cellmate. My agent phoned me up and he said, Charlie, you're not going to do this, but I've got to run it by you. And he told me, and I sort of thought, if you want to be an actor, you can't go around hating people.
While Charlie was learning to understand opposing views, another Northern Ireland personality was doing something to bring the communities together. Boxer Barry McGuigan came from Clones, a small town just over the border in the Irish Republic. But it was in the north that he made his name.
I grew up in a polarised society with policemen with guns and army with guns and you know, bombs and death.
But Barry, a Catholic, managed to bridge the political and religious divide. One of his first big fights took place in a loyalist working men's club on the Shankill Road. At that time, the Shankill was known as a killing zone for Catholics. But extraordinarily, the loyalist paramilitary group, the UVF, guaranteed Barry's safety and even offered an escort. A Barry McGuigan supporters club was formed here on the once notorious Shankill estate. I met some of them.
The fact, Barry, that you realised that you were welcome in an area that wasn't your background, your religion, did that then give you more of a responsibility that when you went into a ring to represent everybody in Northern Ireland and even Ireland?
Yeah, well, that's I think that had a profound effect on me. There was enough badness around me, and I just thought, you know, it's incumbent on me that I do my bit to keep a bit of peace.
And when you boys look back now and you founded the fan club, do you feel that you by finding that you did your bit, that in some way you just kept sort of
100%.
into community relations
right.
going? And
It happens this day, yes.
but you didn't set out to be community workers, did
No,
you? Or
no.
building bridges? You're just fight fans.
I think we started off alcoholics, and then we'll work from that even.
In 1985, Barry became world featherweight champion. But an even bigger achievement was his bringing together thousands of people from both sides at a triumphant homecoming through the streets of Belfast. Sadly, this show of Northern Irish solidarity was only temporary. By the late 80s, Republican and Loyalist paramilitaries were locked in a cycle of tit-for-tat violence. The result was an average of 100 deaths a year, many of the victims entirely innocent. This is the 1988 funeral of Jack Kilty, a prominent Catholic businessman shot dead by Loyalist paramilitaries who burst into his office. His son Patrick, here with his arm round his mother, was just 16 years old.
How did you hear the news that your dad had been murdered?
20 years ago now. I was putting up posters for Comic Relief in school, and I thought I was being called to the headmaster's office because I hadn't asked permission for the posters to be put up. And one of his business partners, whenever I saw him, I was like, there's something not right here. And they told me, and it was that sort of slow motion, weird. It's a bit like that car crash. People talk about a car crash when things are moving, but you're going, is that right? And I suppose it wasn't really then. I was 16 at the time, so it wouldn't have been until I got home to Dundrum and, you know, my brothers and my mum were there, and then that's when it became very real.
What sort of man was your dad?
Much like me, I think. I think I just remember him as someone who, you know, was larger than life and full of life and laughter. And in a way, what happened has made me the man I am today. I've had a very good life. You know, I don't want, this isn't in any way, I don't like talking about this. I've never talked about this, and it's just because I've had a great life. I tell jokes for a living. Someone pays me a lot of money. I live in a very nice house. I've got a lovely family. And this is one thing that happened in my life. There are so many people here in Northern Ireland that this has happened to, and their lives aren't as blessed as mine.
Often, terrorists on both sides claimed that their victims were so-called legitimate targets of war. But Jack Kilty's only crime was to be the wrong religion.
I mean, you'll have people coming up with opinions, oh, there's no smoke without fire, why him? How did you deal with that at that time? I mean, how sure were you that your dad was a victim?
Oh, that was one of the things that helped us completely through that. You know, my dad was a businessman in a small village. He employed both sides of the community. There were Catholics and Protestants working for him. You know, there was some rumor at the time that he was maybe not paying protection money, the bribery money that you needed to pay to the paramilitaries here in Belfast. And one of the things that on the morning of the funeral, and the police very rarely did this, at the time they came out and the police gave a statement to say this man is completely innocent.
Just 4 years after he buried his father, Patrick was performing satirical stand-up comedy about the Troubles.
This is where I really started. This is where I started doing sort of the political satire and doing the material that kind of hadn't been done in Northern Ireland before.
been butchered by the IRA. And this is definitely the work of the Shankill butchers.
A lot of journalists thought that the material that we were tackling was way beyond the edge. People coming in and actually viewing the material were going, how in the name of Christ are these people getting away with this? Yeah. But we needed to do that. We needed to address those issues and maybe to publicly say what was going on in the city.
And did you need to personally do it as well because of what happened to your dad?
No, I didn't need to do the comedy because of what happened to my dad. I was doing comedy, you know, just before my dad was murdered. But I think one of the things it did allow, it gave you a license, in a way, to, no one could come up to you and say, well, what do you know? The weird thing about Northern Ireland at that time was, if you're explaining to someone that your father was murdered by paramilitaries, people go, my God, that's awful. That's an extraordinary thing that's happened to you. Yet if you look at the size of Northern Ireland, very small country, 1.5 million people. You look at the amount of families that are in Northern Ireland. I wasn't extraordinary standing on that stage. I wasn't something special.
Patrick was performing against a backdrop of bloody violence. Throughout the mid-90s, the IRA stepped up attacks on England, bringing the troubles home to people there and playing on Protestant fears that the British, sick and tired, would abandon them.
People would be saying things like, why don't you just tow Northern Ireland into the bloody North Sea and dump it? And you wonder why people over here were bitter about England? Because we were. Because we were, you know, we were thinking about Protestant Catholics joined up together and fought the First World War, the Ulster Division, you know. There's Catholics in the Irish Guards, you know, all this. We joined up together and went and fight for this country. And then there's people over there, because they have a couple of innocents in London, they start saying to us, yeah, you're useless. Why don't you go back to where you come from? I used to get that. I used to get in the terrible fights. We'd be out, you know, somebody would say, you know, why don't you fuck off to where you come from? I beg your pardon?
Despite the pessimism, the 1990s saw the first slow steps towards peace. In April 1998, against the odds, the Good Friday Agreement was signed. Amongst its provisions was the release of prisoners whose paramilitary groups had renounced violence. Former Northern Ireland Minister Mo Mowlam helped broker the deal at a meeting with loyalist inmates. It meant that the man who'd shot Patrick Kilty's father got to walk free.
Did you have the strength to forgive?
I think you've the strength to go on. I remember when early release took place as part of the Good Friday Agreement, and I got a phone call from Mo Mowlam at the time, and I'd met Mo and become friendly with her. And I got a call to say, look, this is happening. The people that have murdered your dad are getting out. And it wasn't a courtesy call. It was like, this is happening. And I think that you look at the bigger picture, you know, for your country, and you look at how things are going to move on. And so if people who did that are getting out, if that means that peace is going to come to this place, then that's a leap that you have to take, in my book. Yet if you look a few thousand miles away, you've got a country which has got civil unrest, civil disobedience. You've got British soldiers stuck in the middle trying to sort out a peace. And yet those guys are terrorists. They shouldn't be talked to. But over here, that's fine. You know.
It worked here. It worked here.
It did work here. So what we should do, we should have devolution then in Iraq. We should have Osama bin Laden Minister for Education.
But whatever its imperfections, since 1998 the peace has largely held. And now many people here would rather forget about the Troubles.
I mean, there are so many painful things that have happened to people. in this province, both Catholic and Protestant, and I mean painful. I mean children being murdered, Catholic children, Protestant children, grannies, grandpas, mothers, fathers, butchered. English guys coming over from East Anglia, Scottish guys from the Highlands, Welsh guys from wherever, getting blown to smithereens. If you start looking back on that, then you just become an angry, twisted so-and-so.
Northern Ireland has now had 10 years of relative peace. Like many people, Charlie Lawson is a different person to the youngster who saw violence as the solution. Today, he's returning to his childhood home on the shores of Lough Erne, near Enniskillen.
I've come back to really just sort of touch base and remembering growing up here in the 60s and 70s, how relevant it is to what we're talking about today, about the changes and how things have moved on and the troubles we've seen, if you like. We were very young, my sister and I. We came across a boat along our foreshore. So being children with bottle, you know, we rowed up to the boat and asked these three men what they were doing, and there was a boat full of fertilizer, you know. We duly reported back to our parents what we had seen, and I would have to say that perhaps we weren't taking that seriously, and lo and behold, the next day, at the top of our avenue, there was a car bomb, and there was 2 UDR men blown to bits. In those days, it was a war zone. There was floodlights in the top of that house, and my father lived here, and when he was heavily into local politics, I mean, he was allowed to have 2 or 3 shotguns, a rifle and a handgun, because we were in the middle of, you know, we were in the middle of Indian country around here, and he was in business, and he was a target. And this is the first time I've been back here in peacetime. And there are no lamps, floodlights up on the house, you know. It's over.
And it's in the cities where the evidence of it being over is most visible. In Belfast, the soldiers have gone, along with the watchtowers and the rubble of bombed-out buildings. The city centre looks new. But will the people here ever go back to the old ways?
That's it. That's what we've got for stopping the fight. It's that thing that's, we've told you, we've been trying to sort you Irish out for so many years, and if you behave yourself, we'll give you nice things. But it's a veneer over the cracks, because you can have Starbucks, you can have sushi, you can have IKEA, you can put all of these things into our society, yet the underlying problems, they're still there, and it's going to take a generation. It's going to take a generation. I find it amazing that there are kids who don't remember the soldiers on the street. And that is where the future's going to be. It's going to be in the next generation. You know, there's always going to be a jaundice with this generation, because we do remember that, oh yeah, where that shiny new store was. People died there, that was blown up.
People, you know, who are my age, who grew up with the Troubles, but who have now got their own children, who are growing up in peace, surely there is, I just think that collectively, there is no way that they would let all of that slip away.
I'm very optimistic about the future, Eamon. I think they haven't quite got through to the poor sections of our society. Once they get the opportunity to earn money, and there'll still be, you know, it'll still take place, the bigotry and the animosity for a number of generations, but over a period of time, I think that will all be diluted with opportunity.
Bottom line, there's a lot of them on both sides, but particularly on perhaps one side, you know, as much as they've made fantastic strides, they did put down the guns and they did start wearing suits because they fancied walking in the corridors of power, and I think that was, and I salute them for doing it. I think brave, courageous decisions to do it. But I think they would now find it hard to take the suits off and go back to the balaclavas. I think they would find it very hard to go back to war. In my very humble, naive opinion, I think if Northern's future is about anything, it is about realising the stupidity of fighting over cultural identities, but not try to change cultural identities.
40 years on, and the new Northern Ireland, so different in so many ways, yet maybe just the same underneath it all. And people say, why talk about it? Why rake over old coals? Why bring back those memories? It makes people feel uncomfortable, as if the piece won't hold, as if we can't believe where we're at. But we are where we are. It is a new beginning. And don't we have to remember so that we never go back there again?
So,